Hello everybody and welcome back to another brainstorm. Today we're going to be talking about stem cells. I'm going to split this video up into three main parts. First of all, we're going to talk about what exactly are stem cells. Then we're going to talk about where are these stem cells found in both plants and animals. And then we're going to round off the video by talking about how are our stem cells used in today's society. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is that how do we get from one single body cell to a whole human body? So we start with two gametes, okay? So I'm going to write that word up here, gamete. And this is just another word for each of the sex cells that come from both the father and the mother. So we start off with our sperm cell and the egg cell, okay? This sperm cell is going to join with the egg cell and it's going to fertilize, okay? So we have this process known as fertilization. And then this egg cell will become this one unified cell, which is called a zygote, okay? So this zygote is just one cell at this point. Then the zygote is going to undergo mitosis, okay? So our mitotic cell division. You remember that this is when we have one cell which divides to produce two identical daughter cells, okay? So this one zygote cell is going to produce two cells, and then these two will produce two more, then we'll have four. And this continues till we have this ball of hollow cells. Now this is our embryo, okay? We're at an embryonic stage. Now the thing about the cells in the embryo is that these are all unspecialized cells. What that means is that they don't have any specific characteristics to carry out any specific functions. But the most important thing that we need to know is that they have the potential to become specialized cells. So each one of these unspecialized embryonic cells can become a muscle cell, a nerve cell, a skin cell, for example, but technically that could be any cell in the body. And they do so in a process known as differentiation. And how that works is each one of these embryonic cells will continue its mitosis, but it will also gain other specific features, such as the long axon for a nerve cell, or lots of mitochondria for a muscle cell. But then it's all of our specialized cells like this that come together to form different tissues, organ systems in the body, and it's these cells that will ultimately form the whole human body. Okay, so now we're going to think back to that sort of embryonic stage of development. You remember that we had that one singular cell, which was called the zygote. I'm going to put Z for zygote down here. And you remember that through mitosis, I'll put M for mitosis, it's going to produce two daughter cells here that are identical to the zygote in terms of their genetics. And these two will produce two more, and then that will carry on to go two more. And eventually we get this bundle of hollow, unspecialized cells, and that's called our embryo. Okay, you remember that these cells have not yet differentiated to produce any specialized cells in the body. They're just unspecialized, undifferentiated cells in the embryo. So, our undifferentiated cells in the embryo have a capability to differentiate, so remember that's the process, to become any type of specialized cell. So these cells can become any cell in the body. And at this stage, when these cells are unspecialized and they're ready to specialize into a certain type of cells, we call these embryonic stem cells. Okay, embryonic stem cells. Okay, and so it's from this idea of the embryonic stem cells that we can find our definition for what exactly is a stem cell. So our stem cells are unspecialized cells that can either form more stem cells through mitosis, or they could differentiate to become any type of specialized cell. So that's our main definition for what is a stem cell. What do we mean by that? Well, if we just take this one stem cell, this could be embryonic, for example. Now this one stem cell could either go through mitosis to produce two daughter stem cells with the same genetic information as this one, or this stem cell could decide to differentiate and become any cell in the body. So this guy might become a red blood cell or a nerve cell, for example. Alright, so now let's talk about where do our stem cells come from. So up till now we've only talked about our embryonic stem cells that come from this bundle of unspecialized cells known as the embryo. Okay, remember that this is a human in really early stages of development. But we can also find stem cells in the adult organism, okay? And because it's from the adult organism, these are called adult stem cells. So where are they found in the adult? Well, there's a soft region inside the bone known as the bone marrow, and this is where we primarily find our adult stem cells, although scientists have found that stem cells can be found in other parts of the body, such as the blood, muscle, brain, liver, etc. There's some other parts as well. But we have a couple of differences between our adult and embryonic stem cells, except for the fact that one comes from an embryo and one comes from an adult. The main difference that we have is their function. Okay, so these embryonic stem cells, you can imagine that it's from an organism that's really early stages of development, and their sole purpose is going to be growth. Okay, so the whole purpose of each one of these cells is to produce more cells, whether that be specialized or just more stem cells. Whereas this adult organism, you can imagine that it's not really got much growing to do at this point. So these are usually reserved for repair, especially reserved for parts of the body that can't repair themselves, such as the nerves. Another difference that we have is the differentiation between them. In a human organism, or any animal for that matter, most of the differentiation of cells takes place in early embryonic stages of development. So you'll remember that we said that each one of these cells has the capability to produce any cell in the body, and this is when most of our differentiation takes place. Whereas by the time we get to an adult organism, there's not really much differentiation that occurs. So for example, here we have the bone marrow. We know that bone marrow is primarily responsible for producing the cells in our blood. So our stem cells that we find in the bone marrow are likely to differentiate into blood cells, such as our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets as well. So generally our adult stem cells only differentiate to cells that are similar to them. Okay, so up until this point we've only talked about stem cells in animals, okay? Humans have been our primary example. But an important thing to know is that we can also find stem cells in plants, okay? So it's not just animals. You remember that previously we said that animal cells tend to only differentiate in early stages of development. So as humans, most of our differentiation of our cells occurs at an embryonic state of development. Whereas the main difference is that plant cells can differentiate throughout their whole life. So it doesn't matter how old this plant gets or how old the plant cell is, it can still differentiate. And probably the most contrasting difference is that we can actually move these plant cells and they will re-differentiate. What do I mean by that? Well, I could take a cell from the root of the plant, move it to the leaf of the plant, and it would re-specialize, and it would gain the features to be a leaf cell now as well. Now, where are our plant stem cells found? Well, they're found in this tissue known as a meristem tissue, which is a tissue or a bundle of cells that is found in the roots and shoots of the plant. So you can imagine that the roots and shoots of the plant is where most of the growth and more importantly, most of the mitosis is going to occur for the plant. So if you look at this diagram here, our apical meristem, or just the meristem tissue, is usually found near the tip of the root or shoot. Okay, so now we've talked about what stem cells are, where they come from, both animal and plant stem cells. We're going to talk about some of their uses, specifically the human stem cells to start off with. So in this video, we're going to be talking about two uses of human stem cells, and the first one is bone marrow transplant. So the reason that bone marrow is transplanted is primarily to treat this disease known as leukemia, and leukemia is a cancer in the bone marrow of a patient. So the way we start off is we take radiotherapy to remove the already cancerous bone marrow. This is where we use high levels of radiation in the body to get rid of the already existing bone marrow. Then this patient will receive a bone marrow transplant from a certain donor. And the bone marrow stem cells which they've received from the donor will do two things. First of all, they're going to differentiate to form the cells of the blood, as they usually would in the body. So that's our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. Okay? These stem cells are also going to divide through mitosis to form more bone marrow. Okay, remember that we got rid of the bone marrow through the radiotherapy, but that's going to be replaced. But there's a couple of problems that we face with our bone marrow transplant here. So the first one is we have a problem of rejection. What do we mean by that? Well, remember that these stem cells are coming from a donor, so that's a different person's body. And these stem cells for the bone marrow are designed to produce white blood cells. But we know that white blood cells, their use is to fight infections, so essentially to kill harmful cells. But because these stem cells are coming from the donor, they're not used to the patient's body. So in turn, they might actually start attacking healthy cells and cause more harm than good. And that's what we mean by rejection. Then obviously with any sort of transplant, we face problem of infection. So if we've got a substance coming from one body to another, so from the donor to our patient, it could cause infections. And finally, we face some religious and ethical dilemmas. So certain religious groups are completely opposed to having transplants or removing anything from the body. So we have some dilemmas when facing that. So the second way that we use stem cells is in a process known as therapeutic cloning. Okay, so for therapeutic cloning, we take embryonic stem cells from the embryo. So you remember previously we talked about this bundle of unspecialized cells called the embryo. So they'll be removed. These cells will then be taken to a lab to be cultured and differentiated to form specific cells. What does that mean? So we're going to take these cells. They'll be taken to a lab where they'll go through mitosis, differentiation, and they will be forming specific bodily cells. So these cells could be muscle cells, liver cells, pancreatic cells, anything like that. And then these cells will go through mitosis to form a tissue. The tissue formed is then transplanted into the same person to cure them. Okay, so the tissue is formed, and then this will be transplanted into the person. So that's the embryo that they were taken from, has grown up, and they might have a disease, and then their own cells can be used to cure them. The great plus that we have with therapeutic cloning is that we have no rejection problem. Remember previously we said that often we see a rejection problem because we have cells coming from someone else's body into the patient's. But because the patient is receiving their own cells, they won't attack their healthy cells and will have no rejection. Two downsides that we have to therapeutic cloning is that again we have these religious and ethical dilemmas. Many people believe that the embryo should be left untouched as well. And that this area of science is greatly under research, and we don't know how this is going to affect everyone, so it's a bit of a give and take area of biology. A couple of ways that we use therapeutic cloning in medicine today is spinal cord injuries, so it can be used to help paralysis in certain patients. Diabetes, sometimes we take pancreatic stem cells and help it to treat diabetes because people will have cells that don't produce enough insulin. And we also can use it to cure blindness and restore eyesight. And then this tissue can actually be used to form cartilage and help damaged bones. Okay, so we know how animal cells are used in modern medicine. Now let's talk about how a plant cell is used today. So plant cells from the meristems can be cloned very quickly and very economically. Okay, so we can produce lots of these cells for a low price, so that's a big positive. So the first way we use them is that we can produce large numbers of rare plants and eliminate extinction. So in the past, we've seen scientists take the stem cells from rare orchids, for example, and these can produce lots of the same cell and produce lots of the same plants. And this eliminates the risk of such a rare species of orchid to go extinct. We can also produce lots of identical plants for research, okay? So if we took this one flower here, we could use its genetically identical daughter cells. Remember, that's what we produce through mitosis. And because they're genetically identical, these plants can be used as a control variable in experiments. So they can be kept exactly the same. And finally, lots of plants can produce with specific features such as resistance to disease. So if one plant decides to develop a resistance to a particular disease, bacterial infection for example, we could then use that plant's stem cells to produce lots of those plants, which is very, very useful in agriculture, for example. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you guys all for watching. Make sure you hit like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you guys soon.